They're coming extensive new rules for cybersecurity incident reporting. They'll cover a lot of industry. The issuing agency is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. The enabling legislation is CIRCIA, the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act. Recently, a hearing took place on the voluminous rulemaking. Cyber policy expert Bob Metzger, a partner at the law firm Rogers, Joseph O'Donnell, joins me in studio with the latest. Bob, good to have you in. And you have been on the forefront of covering all of these cyber policy developments. CIRCIA, just quickly redefine it for us, and then we'll get into what's the latest development here.
Well, CIRCIA was a statute that was passed by Congress a couple of years ago in the wake of the SolarWinds event and the Executive Order 14028. And the combination of these evidence on the part of both Congress and the executive branch, including the president, great concern about the impacts of contemporary cyber threats upon critical infrastructure. It wasn't just SolarWinds, Tom. There were other things such as Colonial Pipeline that caused the leadership of our government on a bipartisan basis and bicameral basis to decide that we needed to do more. And a centerpiece of that effort was to direct the Department of Homeland Security and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is a part thereof, to put out regulations that would broadly require increased reporting of cyber incidents affecting critical infrastructure. Now, the statute itself is quite compelling, but it's also interesting in that it had a surprisingly long timeline. It was passed about 2 years ago. The notice of proposed rulemaking came out, I think, in April. The time for responses has been extended to early July of this year. The proposed rule was extensive, to be charitable. In the pre-publication version, Tom, it was 441 pages in length, a daunting read, more than an evening's requirement. The rule itself, for all of the attention it deserves, won't be published in a final form, probably until sometime around now or later in 2025. And if we take into consideration congressional review requirements, this rule won't be effective until 2026.
Right. And now it's moved from the written proposal and written requirement for responses from industry to people talking about it in a congressional hearing. And you listened to the whole thing. I did not. So basically, what were the concerns and why so long?
Well, the hearing was very interesting. On the congressional side, several of the members clearly had a hand in the authorship of the underlying statute, and they naturally were supportive of the objectives of the legislation. There was remarkable bipartisan agreement on the importance of those objectives, and self-congratulation, perhaps earned, that the often divided Congress could come together and agree on this legislation and its purposes. But there was also something of a consensus of concern about the proposed regulations. Apart from the length, there's a great deal of concern running across a number of the affected sectors, apparently shared by both Republicans and Democrats on the relevant House committee, that the rule is going to be too burdensome, especially on the smaller businesses who could be subject to the present definitions of covered entities. There's a great deal of concern that there will be overlap, duplication, and inconsistency with the other incident reporting requirements of the sector-specific agencies. And there is widespread concern that DHS may set itself up to receive many tens of thousands of cyber incident reports at a level of detail that is too great, at a frequency that is too high, in a volume that is too much, and without the means to address those sensibly and turn them into actionable recommendations for the industries who are at risk.
We're speaking with Bob Metzger, an attorney with Rogers, Joseph O'Donnell. So really the ballooning factor here is the types of items that would have to be reported, not the act of reporting, because you can report something in a simple form they could design next week. But the definition of what is a cyber incident is expansive. And is that what's causing the ballooning of this whole thing?
There's two parts to it. Part of the problem, as you point to, Tom, is the amount of detail that has to be reported when an incident occurs. It is substantial. It requires a description of the security defenses that were in place, which vulnerabilities, if known, were exploited, a description of the techniques, tactics, and procedures that were used by the adversary, known indicators of compromise, and more and more and more. These are not things that are easy to collect in the first 72 hours when you are responding to an event. There's not only a great deal of detail required, but the definitions themselves of a reportable incident arguably are quite broad and could reach things that don't have a substantial or material impact upon the actual operation of the enterprise or the security of the infrastructure to which it's connected.
Well, does the proposal make the distinction between attacks and actual breaches? Because, you look at the statistics, the government loves to say this, and, our systems are attacked by the second, tens of thousands of times a month or a year. We see incoming, they're like meteorites. Very few actually reach Earth, but they're flashing through the sky all the time.
I would say yes, it does, and no, it doesn't. There is qualifying language in the
That's why you're a
proposed
lawyer,
regulation, right? There's qualifying language in the regulation that seems to allow an enterprise to decide whether the impact is substantial, which only calls for reports of certain serious events. But these are words that can be interpreted very widely, and several of those who testified before the House committee were concerned that many companies would decide to report anything and everything that might prove to be substantial, even if it was not. And one or two of the witnesses said that their interpretation of the proposed rule would have them reporting on things that might prove to be incidental. Part of the problem, Tom, is that you've got to collect all this stuff within 72 hours. And if you don't put enough in, you're at risk of getting what they call charitably a request for information for more stuff. And if you decline to respond to that, or you don't respond sufficiently, then you can get a subpoena where bad things happen. So there is a hard edge to this, despite the sort of nicer seeming front end.
Yeah, the government always has that ultimate point of a gun to enforce what it is they want from industry. All right, so the hearing aired these issues, but it's still basically in rulemaking, response, commenting stage at this point.
Right. I did not hear strong opposition from the Hill side during the hearing. I did hear a number of the Republicans express great concern that the small businesses who would be subject to the rule might find this excessively burdensome. And there is a chance that it will be impossible for them. And here's why, briefly. If you're a large organization that's a bank and subject to financial sector regulation, you already do a lot of great stuff. Or, if you're in information or communications, you got a lot of stuff. But if you're a small or medium-sized enterprise, you probably don't have a forensics capability in-house, in place, and operating today. You probably don't have a contact with the technical enterprise that could help you. And the only way, in my judgment, and I have experience with cyber breaches, the only way to respond within the time required with the information demanded is to have almost instantaneous ability to do internal assessment and forensics and to coordinate this with your insurance submissions. And this means you've got to have assistance running on a steady state. You can't wait until the event happens to figure out what to do. Well, that implies a continuing expense for the medium-sized and smaller businesses that is unlikely to be recoverable except through higher charges to consumers or ratepayers, and which really will be burdensome. I expect that Congress will want to see more relief for the smaller and medium-sized enterprises who could be affected, and probably want to set a higher bar for how broadly incidents must be reported and how much information must be initially submitted.
Right, and the other important aspect, which is obvious, but we should mention it anyway, this applies to private sector operators and people involved with critical infrastructure, not just to government contractors.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's why it's different.